Hey, I'm Matt Manny. Thanks so much for joining me for today's devotional thought taken from 6 days to Sunday. I hope this has been an encouragement to you as we're coming along talking about the events that came after Jesus' resurrection on Easter Sunday. We've talked about so far about Mary and how she needed to hear Jesus say her name. We talked about in the previous video about Thomas and about his deep doubts that he had. And we talked about how Jesus simply had to hold his hand and show him the nail prints, the scars in his hand and his side. And today we're going to talk about the start of Peter's story, about how Peter had denied Jesus. And so today's devotional is called Never Too Old for Easter. The passage of scripture for today is John 21, verse 3. Listen to these words. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We're going with you also." And they went out and immediately got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. What's so amazing, and we're going to tie a thread from this thought through the next several devotionals, the start of Peter's ministry of following Jesus had a very similar tone to what is unfolding here in this story. The sad thing about our understanding and belief and trust in Jesus is that right around the same time that we stop believing in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny just happens to be about the same time we stop believing in Jesus. We question things, kind of like Thomas did, as we talked about before. We begin to realize that sometimes people overpromise and underdeliver. And we question people's motives. We realize that there's not everything's cracked up to what it seems to be. And so we begin to have doubts and we begin to question those in authority, teachers, parents, coaches, and it kind of carries us through the rest of our lives if we're not careful. So we find Peter, he's disillusioned, he's disappointed, and so we find that there's this sense of we need to harden our hearts and stiffen up and put on a stiff upper lip and kind of grow up in a sense. What's interesting is C.S. Lewis, the famed author who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, he also wrote many other incredible works of literature. But listen to what he says when he wrote this simple essay in 1952 entitled On Three Ways for Writing for Children. He writes this: "Critics who treat the term adult, quote unquote, as a term of approval instead of as a merely descriptive term cannot be adult themselves. To be concerned about being grown up, to admire the grown up because it is grown up, to blush at the suspicion of being childish, these things are the marks of childhood and adolescence. And in childhood and adolescence, they are, in moderation, healthy symptoms. Young things ought to want to grow. But to carry on into middle life or even into early manhood, this concern about being an adult is a mark of really arrested development. When I was 10, I read fairy tales in secret and would have been ashamed if I had been found doing so. Now that I'm 50, I read them openly. When I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness and the desire to be very grown up." It's interesting, as you notice, he says there, that change, that transition. As a child, we find this sense of coming of age where we fear being found out, and we fear being considered childish or playing and having these thoughts and getting lost in these world and fairy tales. And yet we lose that childlike faith. He quotes there a term from Paul's writings where Paul says, "When I was a child, I thought as a child, I acted as a child, but now I've come and I've grown up and matured." And yet Jesus echoes these sentiments as Jesus says that it takes faith like a child for us to be able to have a belief and faith in Jesus himself. So for Mary, she needed to hear Jesus say her name. Thomas needed to hold Jesus' hand. And for Peter, his next step was to go fishing. Peter needed to know that everything was going to be okay. He needed to know that Jesus still loved him even after he denied Jesus. And John, throughout his take on this story in John chapter 20 and 21, he gives us this interesting snapshot of the one-on-one encounter with Jesus. He has the nighttime talk with Nicodemus, the woman at the well, and then this amazing encounter of Peter with Jesus at the seashore. As we talk about in the next devotional, we'll discover this interesting and amazing interaction that Peter has with Jesus. And what we find is this: sometimes we try to cope with hope in that we can't let ourselves believe. We can't let ourselves acknowledge that we need this encounter with Jesus, to have a coming to Jesus moment. and realizing that sometimes we need to step back and let aside our suspicions and our fear and our doubts and be able to embrace Jesus once again. Thanks so much for watching. Join me in the next devotional as we'll talk more about Peter's story and his encounter with Jesus. Thanks so much for watching.